Good morning, Typographics. Thank you, Ellen, Sasha, Barbara, Mike, and Kara. As Ellen mentioned, I'm Silas Munro, and I'm here to share with you some research about W.E.B. Du Bois that's very close to my heart. It's close to my heart because it's about graphic design, which I love, but it's also close to my heart because it's about identity. It's about humanity, and that transcends race, color, creed, gender, nationality. And it's about using form to turn data into a kind of utopia, or at least the hope for utopia. I want to acknowledge that this research I present today is collaborative, and it's the product of my contribution to a new book called W.E.B. Du Bois Data Portraits, Visualizing Black America. The book is edited by Whitney Battle-Baptiste and Britt Russert, and it's published by Princeton Architectural Press, and will be out on shelves October 23rd. I'm going to channel RuPaul and say you can pre-order it now on Amazon. And it'll be just in time for W.E.B.'s 150th birthday, which is this year. Speaking of fierce, Britt and Whitney teach at UMass Amherst, where Du Bois left his papers and archives, so they are foremost scholars and stewards of his work. And actually, I was talking to Kara before the conference, and she said that W.E.B. Du Bois spoke at Cooper Union 4 different times. There's actually a ledger in the Cooper Library. So that, I think, is good vibes. And by the way, when I pronounce his name, I say Du Bois. It's funny because if you're French, you would say Du Bois, based on the way that it's spelled. But he pronounced it Du Bois. So, with that being said, can I take you all on a journey? Yes. Okay, it's through time and space. We have about 15 minutes. So I've prepared a meal for you. Here's the menu. The first course is an amuse-bouche, the color line, followed by an appetizer, my design historiography, the entree, a Negro exhibit in Paris, and the longest and most rich part of the meal, my favorite part, is dessert. So there's 2 parts to dessert, the Georgia Negro and another related project, a series of statistical charts illustrating the condition of the descendants of former African slaves now in residence in the United States. And I'll just call that second one a series of statistical charts for time's sake. And then to wash it all down, we have a digestif. Are you hungry? Okay, here we go. So the amuse-bouche, the color line. So this is Du Bois' most famous quote. The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. It was published in his book in 1903, The Souls of Black Folks, but he actually mentioned it in a lecture in 1900. And basically, it's about this idea of race and class both being this sort of intersectional challenge for America. And the way that looked like for Du Bois is expressed through this data. These are the dessert that you'll see later, but I just wanted you to see them all at once. So these are gouache and ink compositions. They're 22 inches by 28 inches, so they're like big broadsheet posters. And there's 63 of them. And these compositions basically are a form of infographic activism. So I just wanted you to whet your palate with this, and we're going to dive deeper into that. So for me, these visualizations offer a prototype of design practices that are now vital in our contemporary world, even though they were made in 1900. This idea of design for social innovation, data visualization in the service of social justice, and the decolonization of pedagogy. Tastes good? Okay, so now for the appetizer. I think to explain this lecture, really, you need to also get a little taste of my own design historiography. Anyone know what historiography is? Exactly. So we're going to go back to me, a 19-year-old design student studying history. I had 2 key professors, one in 2000, Doug Silver Fox Scott, handsome guy, teaches graphic design history at RISD. And then later in 2008, Lorraine Fierce Wild, right? Yes, two foremost scholars of design history. And I just was, as I was looking into this Du Bois research, I was like, where did they get their history? Both of them were educated at Yale in the graduate program there, and they would be influenced by a key text that was published in 1983, Phil Meggs, right? And then other European designers that taught at Yale and American designers that were teaching by their side, people like Paul Rand, Bradbury Thompson. Also, Lorraine would have known a man named Lou Danziger, who taught one of the first graphic design history courses at CalArts on the West Coast. And also Curveball, Lorraine is one of the few people who also has a BFA from Cranbrook and MFA. So there's this lines of design history crossing, but maybe we see a pattern here. No one that really looks like Du Bois, right? And the kind of ideas behind the way history is framed have a shape to them. They have a visual language. Most design history courses, including both those history courses that I took, see history as a timeline, a kind of modernist clothesline where you pin up the history of design cultivated through a certain canon, going back from cuneiform and writing on tablets, through Caves of Lascaux, Victorian wallpaper, William Morris, modernism, Toulouse-Lautrec, the Bauhaus, 20th century movements culled out and elevated on sort of a plinth. I think there are other ways you could think about design history as well. So, for example, you could think about design history as more of a nodal network, so points of resonance where you sort of have connections between significant factors. So, for example, you could think about the relationship between a teacher and a student, like Herbert Bayer and Walter Gropius at the Bauhaus. Or you can think about contemporaries like Joseph Müller-Brockmann or Carl Gerstner and Armin Hoffman. So this idea of a kind of graphic design string theory, and you could sort of make your own kind of relationships or your own family, a kind of thematic, rhizomatic way of looking at design history. And there's one other way that now I'm looking at history based on this research, which is this idea of when you find a forgotten piece of history, you sort of need to start thinking and reconsidering what's major and what's minor in graphic design history. So for me, I thought, the Bauhaus, things that Herbert Bayer was doing, or, the isotype over here, Russian constructivism was most important. But the work I'm about to show you was done 19 years before any of those things happened. So you have to really reconsider and reframe this idea, and history is really relational. Are you with me still? Okay, good. Okay, now it's time for the entree. So, we're now going back to 1900. Picture Paris at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries. I present to you our hero, W.E.B. Du Bois, in his top hat and finery. Very cool looking guy. So this is him in Paris at the eve of the exhibition of the Negro Exhibit. Just to tell you a little about him in his own words, he described himself as, "I was born by a golden river in the shadow of two great hills, 5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, which began the freeing of American Negro slaves. In general thought and conduct, I became quite thoroughly New England." So this is a guy who was raised by a single mother, his mom and his grandmother, Sarah Burghardt. He went to Fisk University in Tennessee, and then he went to Harvard. He studied under William James. You might know him, he's the father of modern psychology. So he was a self-made man. He was funding himself his 3 years at Harvard from money from summer jobs and inheritance, scholarships. He took out loans. So he had a bachelor's degree in history from Harvard, plus the degree from Fisk. He gets a fellowship to study in Berlin to go abroad, and then he comes back and gets his PhD at Harvard, and he's the first man of color to do that. He went to Philadelphia for a while, UPenn, worked on the Philadelphia Negro, and then he went in 1897 to Atlanta University, a historically black college, where he works on this project with his students. It was quite collaborative. The thing is, he did not do this alone. So in addition to W.E.B. Du Bois, there was a charismatic man named Thomas J. Calloway who had the connections to the Library of Congress and to the government. He was a war clerk, lawyer, and he sort of put this dream team together to create this exhibit that would show the best of people of color at an international stage. But, curveball, W.E.B. Du Bois had to work with his frenemy, Booker T. Washington, who totally opposed his philosophy and had a different point of view. So you have this elegant, bourgeois W.E.B. Du Bois, and you have the agrarian, hardworking Booker T. Washington. So they kind of butted heads. What's also interesting to note, thank you, Du Bois, this is his exhibitor card for the Paris Exposition. It was easier for the actual work, the graphic design, to travel than for him to get to Paris. And this is what he says in his diaries reflecting later. The details of finishing these 50 or more charts in colors with accuracy was terribly difficult with little money, limited time, and not too much encouragement. I was threatened with nervous prostration before I was done and had little money left to buy passage to Paris, nor there was a cabin left for sale. But the exhibit would fail unless I was there, so at the last moment I bought passage in steerage and went over and installed the work. So this image of Du Bois traveling abroad in Atlantic steerage, close proximity to the hull of the ship, it doesn't really sit well with our idea of this sort of intellectual that's world traveled, but it was the harsh reality. So when he gets there, this would sort of be his view. The Eiffel Tower had just been completed 2 years before. This is a stereograph showing its construction. And so this would kind of be in the skyline of this World's Fair. You can sort of think of this as kind of like the Venice Biennale, right, in Paris, where we have all these different countries with pavilions. This is the American pavilion in Beaux Arts architectural style, where they're all along the Rue of the Seine, and in this kind of like global competition to prove which country was the best, most smartest, most rich. And inside of this pavilion, you have the Palace of Social Economy, which is where this exhibit was. So you would see up here in this corner was this Negro exhibit, and it was meant to be sort of this like thing off to the side that wouldn't have that much impact, but it actually won all these awards. It won the gold prize for exhibition design and was just like incredibly successful. And thousands of people would have flocked and seen this exhibit. And I want to take you inside and show you what that exhibit looks like. So not only is he doing all this scholarship and writing, but he's actually designing an exhibit. It's very similar to the work that Ellen's doing over at the Cooper Hewitt, right? It's a sensory, multi-dimensional experience, and it's not static. So if you see here, there are the plates on these movable wings that you can kind of sift through. There's so much data. I mean, 63 of these big posters, and they all fit in this space. In addition, there were photographs of people of color. There were texts and novels. There was a bust of Frederick Douglass, actually, right here. You can see it. I'll point with my laser right there, sitting there. So it was this rich, immersive experience. You could sit with these books and digest it all. And then the show would also travel. It would come back from Paris and go to all these historically black colleges. It would go to museums. So this is a souvenir with a picture of Calloway standing and, Calloway seated and Du Bois standing. So you can see the posters that I'm going to show in the background. Feeling full? Feeling good? You ready for dessert? Awesome. Okay. So just going back a year later, so he really only had about 9 months to work on this project with his students. So he generates all of these amazing products, and they were the product of multiple forms of collaboration and co-creation. Across the diagrams, there are references to Atlanta University, and actually the lead infographic of the second series of the images explicitly states it was prepared and executed by Negro students under the direction of Atlanta University. Contemporary sources suggest that an Atlanta University alumnus, William Andrews Rogers, who had recently received his bachelor's degree in sociology, was the point person responsible for making and coordinating the design and production of the actual graphics. Few records remain about the working methods of Rogers, who may have been living in Petersburg, Virginia at the time. Based on the volume of the designs, each piece's complexity in detail, and compressed project timeline of only a few months, it seems implausible that Rogers and Du Bois worked alone to complete the project, and they no doubt facilitated renderings and typesetting from additional unnamed Atlanta University students and alumni who assisted the collection of field data. And so this is not Atlanta University students, but this is kind of what their work space would look like, letterpress and gouache and ink. And they were doing research, they did their homework, so they probably would have been familiar with other statisticians and designers who had created information design before them. This is a chart by Florence Nightingale. It's a rose diagram, and she used it to convince the British Army to increase the amount of health care for their wounded soldiers. So there was precedent for smart people using data to persuade others. Also, the visual language predates something like this, which happened in 1925, which is Herbert Bayer's universal alphabet. I think definitely look closely at the modular elements that are here. You know, circles, triangles, rectangles, and bright primary colors in black and white. And, you know, it just flips my wig to think like this stuff came after the Du Bois stuff, and this is what's considered sort of the beginning of modernism. Another sort of thing to note, Otto Neurath and his wife Marie Neurath created this isotype picture language. Du Bois has elements in his projects that reference these, and these came 30 years later. So, these are the two title plates for the two sets. So on the left you see the Georgia Negro, and on the right you see the series of statistical charts. And the charts have a lot of variety to them. They use a range of visual strategies: geographic maps, circle and spiral diagrams, bar and area charts, and complex tables and grids. And they deal with subjects ranging from economic class. And these are all one-offs. They were not mass-produced because of their limited budget. So I'm going to just start and dive in to the first plate. So he opens the first set with this map. It's very striking, and it's got two interconnected circles with fine lines that track dark areas of Africa to equally dark swaths of the United States, the Caribbean, and South America. And you'll notice there's a solitary white star right here, and that represents Georgia. So you get this context of the study, and he's connecting the data that you see in Georgia and the United States to hundreds of years and thousands of miles of oppression, all in one image. The other slide, designed as a proclamation in type and image form, is the first panel in the second series, and it's the most dense. It's very self-referential. You could see the mention to Atlanta University, and all of the charts that follow feature the strategic mix of typographic families and styles. The principal type here appears to be a sans serif or grotesque, which predates the 20th century, but if you look closer, you actually see that it has no curves, there's only straight lines, and that they're more akin to lettering generated by templates designed for architectural or engineering lettering styles. And based on the author's training in sociology rather than graphic design, it would make sense for the Atlanta University students to use some kind of templates or pre-existing tools. And the residue of technical lettering is evident if you look at the lighter weights of this typeface, which have the French translation. The diacritic marks, these accents, have a heavier weight to them, so they probably modified the template while they were working on it so that they could have both languages. This is plate 12, simply titled Slaves and Free Negroes. So there's a chronological reading from top to bottom, and it's so interesting. Look at the visual language. On the right, in the red, it's so crisp, so geometric. On the left, you have this rough, deckled edge, and that's very intentional if you look at a detail. So it's not that they're being sloppy, they had too much coffee, right? Like, they're actually putting an emotional resonance into the information. And they're so simple and so graphic at times. This is a chart about Negro teachers in Georgia public schools. And you have these 4 monochromatic circles, and they float in this solitary column, each slightly larger than the previous one. And he doesn't even have a key here. There's just sets of numbers here. And if you zoom in, look at this detail. There is actually yellow gouache in the type inside there. So they're being very meticulous about every piece of type and image that they're putting together. I call this the cash money diagram. You can really see the isotype here. He's using bags of money to literally represent the value of land owned by Georgia Negroes. And so this kind of iconographic approach is a precedent to work that would surface 2 decades later. It's just so beautiful. Even there's little drawstrings on the bags. Many of the topics that Du Bois would explore were also controversial at that time and this time. So this is a chart titled Race Amalgamation in Georgia, and he's investigating the relationship between class and skin tone. So as a free northern-born, globally educated, internationally traveled scholar, he would have a deep personal empirical experience with what we know as colorism now. And so this chart shows 3 categories of race: black or full-bodied Negroes, brown or persons with some white blood or descendants of light-colored Africans, and yellow or persons with more white than Negro blood. And you can see again, when you zoom in, a really intense level of detail. It even puts blood, like a blood red, in that 40%. And this chart is a great example where they would take similar sets of data, but render them in different ways. So if you actually look at plate 54 in the second set, it's also about colorism, but it has a totally different visual language. So it's an area chart with gradation instead of this bar chart. And I just love looking at these 2 side by side, where you can see like they're really experimenting and seeing what's the best visual form for this data. Many of the diagrams were sequenced strategically. I love this map, which has the population of Georgia by counties in 1890. And this is a great way of looking at the color of the gouache with this sort of opaque finish that bonds with the paper background. And I think there's an interesting tie to graphic design history, where for those of you who were educated a little bit earlier as graphic designers, you used actual like gouache or placa to design graphic design on paper, which I definitely did as part of my education, and sort of connects to the Swiss schools, that would be influential on American design education. People like Armin Hoffman and his students from the Basel School of Design. So this plate follows that other plate, so there's kind of this sequence of data, progressive disclosure of information, where it's zooming in and now showing the county population over time. And to me, when I look at these, I really think about the idea of a heat map. The color is kind of giving you information where you get a quick read right away, and which is interesting because the heat map was not created until 1993 by Cormac McCarthy, who actually used it for financial information and mutual funds. This is an assessed valuation of all taxable property. This is just so graphic to me. This makes me think of like the work of Kandinsky, or Klee, like this geometric abstraction with these sharp points kind of coming in together, and you can see this like rich texture in here. It really reads like a bullseye, like your eye is really drawn in like a target. And part of this design innovation that Du Bois and his team were doing was like he created new chart types. Like, I'm not sure if this is a bar graph or a pie chart, or maybe it's like a Du Bois hybrid together. And the data points were very big things like property, but this is about household furniture and kitchen appliances. So there was this humanizing aspect to the data sets that he chose, and they're just very hypnotic and really beautiful, and built on things like what Florence Nightingale did, or Playfair, William Playfair, who was the Scottish statistician who invented the pie chart. This is city and rural population. Just love how they're using this economy of space, and you again go from something that's very linear into something that's very radial. It's just so strange and has that tricolor palette that I think of early avant-garde art and design movements. They also did things with a high level of detail. So in addition to the gouache, they would have used something called a stylographic pen, sort of a precursor to like a fine nib pen, where they can get this incredible detailed line using totally analog means. And the last plate I'm going to show you, to me, this looks like something you could create in InDesign. There's photography, there's typography, there's bar charts, there's even a bit of gold foil. And, this is family budgets based on class, and this sort of pastels colored subcategories are shown for things like rent, food, clothing, direct taxes, and other expenses. And I just love that he makes this digestible. He makes it easy to access. And actually, in this plate, you can see didactic information directing the viewer to actually, for further statistics, to lift the frame. So it's like in reference to that exhibit. So you could actually be guided to get more information. How was dessert? Yeah, rich, right? So now for the digestif. Although Du Bois and his team were hardly the first to visualize data with this level of rigor in the pre-computation era, these designs are unique and important. The rhetorical innovation in the social sciences, coupled with a visual aesthetic very much at home in the 21st century, makes for a prescient body of design work. These visualizations offer a prototype of design practices that were not widely utilized until more than a century later, and now vital to our contemporary world. I just wanted to put the images of the other collaborators on the book up here and a cover of the book. So Britt Russert, Whitney Battle-Baptiste, Mabel O. Wilson also wrote an essay, and so did Alden Morris. Thank you so much for your time.